Hello and welcome back. In the previous video, we were talking about the law being holy, walking in the law of the Lord, or in the direction of the Lord. But then there was a question about, what does it mean to work out your salvation? Well, Paul talks about it. Let's go to Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. He says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Here's a couple of things that I have learned. One, the word salvation, the Greek word there, means deliverance. Well, that makes sense because Jesus is our deliverer. And so he delivers us from the wages of sin. But here's something that's interesting. The words work out is one Greek word that actually means perform, accomplish, achieve. Well, time out. What do you mean? I have to perform to accomplish and to achieve salvation? Well, surely not, because Paul himself says that you cannot achieve salvation through works of the law, that it's only through faith that I can actually gain salvation. So what is Paul talking about? Why is he saying perform, accomplish, achieve, deliverance? Well, let's talk about a story that I guess you're probably very familiar with. And that's the story of the Exodus. So what was the situation? Well, the Israelites had gone to Egypt, and over time they had become slaves in Egypt. Just like before we know Jesus, we are slaves to sin. And what happens? Well, God sends a deliverer to deliver his people, just like he sent the deliverer, Jesus, to deliver us from the wages of sin. But what happens after 9 plagues? The Lord instructs him, put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of the house, and death passes over them. But do they stay in Egypt? No, they walk out of Egypt. But then what happens? Well, the Egyptian army comes after them. But God opens the waters. They walk through the water, and the water destroys the Egyptian army. They are delivered from sin. And now they are free. But in what direction are they walking? Well, they're walking towards the promised land. They're walking from Egypt to the promised land. But what does he give them between the time they left from Egypt and the time they went to the promised land? Well, they went to Mount Sinai, and he gave them the law. Now, why would he give them the law? Well, they had learned to be slaves in Egypt. That's what they had become accustomed to. Just like before Jesus, we're accustomed to do what? The wages of sin. We are accustomed to walk in sin, to walk in our flesh, and to really be under the death, which is the wages of sin, is death. That's what we're used to. So what did he have to do? He had to give them, remember what the law means? Instruction. Give them a direction so that they no longer want to go back to Egypt, but they want to go to the promised land. And they needed to know how to operate in the promised land because they were just used to Egypt. And actually, what happened? Well, the first time they were going to go into the promised land, they didn't go in. And the Lord had to do what? The Lord had to take them through the wilderness for 40 years to do what? Teach them how to live no longer in the ways of Egypt, no longer in the ways of sin, but in his ways, in the ways of light, in the ways of the promised land, in the ways of righteousness. So here's a quick picture. What can we say about Egypt? Well, Egypt represents darkness, and it represents sin. And what would the promised land represent? Well, it would represent light, it will represent righteousness. And so now, when we go back to John chapter 12, verse 35, it makes a little more sense to me. For Jesus said to them, "For a little while longer the light is among you. Walk while you have the light, so that darkness will not overtake you. He who walks in the darkness does not know where he goes. So those who remained in Egypt, they didn't know where they were going because they had no direction. But those who came those who came out of Egypt had to walk in his light. The darkness would not overtake them, just like the Egyptian army tried to overtake them. So that's what the law is about. That's why he gives us the law. And that's why it's called an instruction and a direction. Now, you may be thinking, as I did at one point in time, wait a minute, he's given me the law? But didn't he save me from the penalty of the law? Because I'm no longer under the law. That's what Paul talks about. I'm no longer under the law. I'm no longer under the penalty of the law. So what does that mean? Because what we're seeing is that the law is actually an instruction and a direction. So how do we tie those things together? Well, that's what I want to talk about in this next video.